My brother showed up at my wedding and grabbed the microphone. He yelled, "The bride is actually my wife, not yours." The feedback screech cut through the reception hall at exactly 3:47 p.m., making all 180 guests wince in their seats. I was standing at the front of the room next to my bride, Isabel, who'd just finished her vows 2 minutes earlier. We'd been pronounced husband and wife 60 seconds ago, and I'd been about to give my planned speech thanking everyone for coming when my brother Garrett lunged past the DJ booth and ripped the microphone from its stand. His face was red and sweating despite the air conditioning, his expensive suit rumpled like he'd slept in it. The words he screamed didn't make sense at first, my brain refusing to process them even as they echoed off the vaulted ceiling of the country club ballroom. "I'm Ethan Carver, and I'd been planning this wedding for 14 months, every detail coordinated with precision because Isabel deserved perfection. We'd met 3 years earlier at a medical conference where I was presenting research on cardiovascular surgery techniques, and she was a pharmaceutical rep showcasing a new blood thinner. She'd approached me after my presentation with intelligent questions about surgical applications, and we'd ended up talking for 4 hours over coffee that turned into dinner. Isabel was beautiful in an understated way, with dark hair she wore in a practical ponytail and green eyes that seemed to see through any pretense. She was funny and ambitious and made me feel like the best version of myself. Garrett had been my best man, standing beside me throughout the ceremony in his charcoal gray suit, holding the rings when prompted and smiling at all the right moments. He was 2 years older than my 31 years, worked in commercial real estate, and had always been charismatic in that effortless way some people are. Growing up, he'd been the popular one while I was the quiet kid who studied too much. Our parents had died in a car accident when I was in medical school, leaving us as each other's only immediate family. We'd grown closer after their deaths, or so I'd thought, bonding over shared grief and supporting each other through the aftermath. He'd introduced me to Isabel, actually, claiming he knew her through a mutual friend in the pharmaceutical industry and thought we'd hit it off. He'd been right. Now he was standing in front of 180 wedding guests, claiming my wife was his wife, and I felt my legs go weak with confusion and rage. Isabel's hand tightened on mine, her nails digging into my palm hard enough to hurt. Her face had gone completely pale, all the carefully applied makeup unable to hide the shock draining the color from her skin. She wasn't looking at Garrett. She was staring straight ahead at nothing, her breathing shallow and rapid like she might pass out. That reaction sent the first spike of real fear through my chest, because if this was just my brother having a psychotic break, she should have looked confused or angry. Instead, she looked terrified. Garrett wasn't done talking. The microphone was live, and his voice carried perfectly to every corner of the reception hall, where our friends, colleagues, and extended family sat frozen in their seats. "We've been married for 8 months. Show them the marriage certificate, Isabel. Show them the apartment we share in Philadelphia. Tell them about the life insurance policy you took out on me last year." His voice cracked on the last sentence, emotion raw and genuine in a way that made my stomach drop. This wasn't a joke or a prank. He believed what he was saying. My best friend Colin, who'd been sitting at the head table with the wedding party, jumped up and started moving toward Garrett. Colin was an attorney who specialized in corporate law, not exactly trained for physical confrontations, but he grabbed Garrett's arm and tried to pull him away from the microphone. Garrett shoved him hard enough that Colin stumbled backward into a table, sending champagne glasses crashing to the floor. The sound of shattering crystal cut through the shocked silence that had fallen over the room. Someone's mother screamed. The photographer's camera flashed repeatedly, capturing every moment of the disaster unfolding in real time. I found my voice finally, though it came out hoarse and strained. "Garrett, what the hell are you doing? Have you lost your mind?" But even as I said it, I was looking at Isabel, searching her face for the denial and outrage that should have been there. Instead, I saw guilt. Just for a second before she smoothed her expression into shock and confusion, I saw guilt flash across her features so clearly it was like a confession. My hand dropped from hers, and I took a step back, the physical distance feeling necessary, even though we were still standing inches apart in our wedding finery. The wedding coordinator, a efficient woman named Dorothy, who'd been managing events for 23 years, was on her phone calling security. The country club had actual security guards who patrolled the property, and 2 of them appeared within 90 seconds, moving quickly through the crowd toward the front of the room. Garrett saw them coming and made one last desperate attempt to reach Isabel, extending his hand toward her like he expected her to take it and run. "Tell them the truth, Izzy. Please. I know you love me. I know this whole thing with Ethan was just for the money, but we can fix this. We can still fix this." The security guards grabbed him under each arm and started hauling him toward the exit. He fought them, twisting and shouting, but they were professionals and had him contained quickly. His voice echoed back through the hall as they dragged him out. "Check her phone. Check the messages. Check everything. You'll see I'm telling the truth." Then he was gone, the heavy doors closing behind him with a thud that seemed to seal off whatever reality he'd been trying to drag into our wedding. Silence stretched across the reception hall like a physical presence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. All eyes were on Isabel and me, waiting to see what would happen next. The officiant who'd married us, Reverend Thomas Bellamy, who'd known my family for decades, cleared his throat nervously and started to say something about continuing with the reception, but his words died in the awkward atmosphere. Dorothy approached us cautiously, her professional mask firmly in place. "Mr. Carver, would you and Mrs. Carver like to step into the private lounge for a few minutes? I can have your guests served appetizers while you collect yourselves." I looked at Isabel, really looked at her for the first time since Garrett's outburst. She was crying now, perfect tears running down her cheeks and ruining her makeup, but something about the tears felt calculated. They appeared at exactly the right moment to generate sympathy, to position her as the victim of my brother's delusion. When she met my eyes, I saw her scrambling for the right response, trying to read what I needed to hear. "Ethan, I don't understand what just happened. Your brother has been acting strange lately, but I never thought he'd do something like this. We need to call a doctor. He needs help." The words were perfect, concerned, loving, exactly what a confused bride should say. But they rang hollow because of that split second of guilt I'd seen before she'd composed herself. I nodded slowly and let Dorothy guide us toward the private lounge off the main reception hall. Behind us, I could hear the murmur of conversation starting up as guests began processing what they'd just witnessed. My phone was already buzzing in my pocket, probably texts from people who'd been watching the ceremony but not in the room. The private lounge was small and elegant with leather furniture and dark wood paneling. Dorothy closed the door behind us and promised to give us privacy while she managed the guests. The moment we were alone, Isabel grabbed my hands and started talking rapidly. "Ethan, I'm so sorry. I don't know what's wrong with Garrett, but he's been texting me strange things for weeks. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to cause problems between you two. He kept saying he loved me and that we belonged together. I thought it was just wedding stress making him act weird. I never imagined he'd create this whole fantasy about us being married." I pulled my hands away from hers and sat down on the leather couch, my brain trying to process too many conflicting signals at once. Garrett had been acting strange lately. He'd called me less frequently over the past few months, and when we did talk, he seemed distracted and on edge. I'd attributed it to stress from a big real estate deal he was closing. He'd lost weight too, I realized now. When I'd seen him yesterday at the rehearsal dinner, he'd looked gaunt and exhausted, his suit hanging off his frame in a way that suggested he'd dropped 15 or 20 pounds recently. But the specifics he'd mentioned didn't sound like fantasy. A marriage certificate, an apartment in Philadelphia, a life insurance policy. Those were oddly concrete details for a delusion. I looked up at Isabel and asked the question I needed answered, even though I was afraid of the response. "Have you been to Philadelphia in the past year?" She hesitated just a fraction of a second too long before answering. "For work? Yes. I had a pharmaceutical conference there last October. Why?" I stood up and pulled out my phone, my hands shaking slightly as I opened the messaging app. "Give me your phone." Isabel's eyes widened and she took a step back. "What? No. Ethan, you're being paranoid. Your brother just ruined our wedding with insane accusations and now you're treating me like I'm guilty of something?" Her voice had an edge of indignation that would have been convincing if I hadn't seen that flash of guilt earlier. I kept my hand extended. "If there's nothing to hide, you'll give me your phone. Right now." The calculation that crossed her face was subtle, but unmistakable. She was weighing options, trying to decide which response would work best. Finally, she reached into her small clutch purse and pulled out her iPhone, but she didn't hand it to me immediately. "I want you to know that whatever messages you find from Garrett, they're all one-sided. I never encouraged him. I was trying to handle it quietly without hurting your relationship with your brother." She placed the phone in my hand, and I noticed it was shaking. I unlocked her phone using the passcode I'd seen her enter 100 times and opened her messages. There was no thread with Garrett under his name, but when I searched for his number, I found a thread under the contact name, Property Manager, Philly. The messages went back 8 months, and the first ones I opened made my chest tighten with a pain that felt physical. Garrett's messages were intimate and familiar, calling her baby and my wife, and referencing shared memories of trips they'd taken together. Isabel's responses were just as intimate, filled with heart emojis and "I love you," and detailed plans for their future. I scrolled back to the oldest messages and found what I was looking for. Pictures. Photos of Isabel and Garrett together that I'd never seen, taken in locations I didn't recognize. In one, they were kissing on what looked like a beach at sunset. In another, they were dressed formally at what was clearly a wedding, but not our wedding. Isabel was wearing a simple white dress and holding a bouquet. Garrett wore a dark suit and had his arm around her waist. Behind them, I could see a city hall building with Philadelphia Marriage Bureau visible on a sign. The nausea hit me like a wave and I had to sit back down. I looked up at Isabel, who was watching me with an expression I couldn't read. "You married him. You actually married my brother 8 months ago." My voice sounded distant to my own ears, like someone else was speaking. She opened her mouth to respond, but I held up my hand to stop her. Don't say anything yet. I need to see all of it first." I kept scrolling through the messages, finding a timeline that made the betrayal worse with each revelation. Isabel had met Garrett first, not me. Their relationship had started 2 months before I'd met her at that medical conference. Garrett had introduced us deliberately, setting up the meeting and encouraging me to pursue her. In the messages, Isabel referred to me as the Mark and discussed strategy for getting me to propose quickly. There were calculations about my assets, my salary as a cardiovascular surgeon, My life insurance through the hospital. They'd planned this together. The life insurance policy Garrett had mentioned was real. I found messages discussing it in detail. 6 months ago, Isabel had convinced me to increase my coverage to $3 million, saying it was responsible planning for when we had children. She'd helped me fill out the paperwork and had listed herself as the beneficiary. In the messages, she and Garrett discussed how to handle it after I was dead, splitting the money and moving somewhere tropical where they could start over without anyone knowing about their connection. After I was dead. The words hit me like a physical blow. I looked up at Isabel sharply. You were planning to kill me. It wasn't a question. She started shaking her head rapidly, backing toward the door. No, that's not what those messages mean. You're misinterpreting everything. Garrett is obsessed with me, and those were his fantasies, not mine. I was just playing along to keep him calm while I figured out how to tell you. The door opened before she could reach it, and Colin stepped in, his expression grim. Security has Garrett outside, but he's refusing to leave until the police arrive. He called 911 and reported a fraud and conspiracy. There are 2 patrol officers on their way here now. Colin looked at me with concern etched in every line of his face. What's happening, Ethan? What did he mean about Isabel being his wife? I held up her phone, showing Colin the screen with the wedding photo. She married him 8 months ago in Philadelphia. This whole thing with me was a setup. They were planning to kill me for the life insurance. Saying it out loud made it real in a way that looking at the evidence hadn't. My best friend's face went from concern to horror as he processed what I'd told him. Colin was sharp and had immediately grasped the implications. He turned to Isabel with a look of such disgust that she flinched. You married both of them? That's bigamy? That's a felony? Isabel's composure finally cracked completely. She lunged for her phone in my hand, trying to grab it back, but I held it away from her. Those messages aren't what they look like. You're taking everything out of context. Garrett is mentally ill, and I was trying to manage him without getting you involved. This is all his delusion, not mine. But her protestations sounded desperate and unconvincing even to my ears. Colin positioned himself between us, his lawyer instincts kicking in. Don't say anything else, Isabel, seriously. The police are coming and anything you say right now can be used against you. The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of activity. The 2 patrol officers arrived and Dorothy directed them to the private lounge where we were waiting. Officer Raymond Kwan and Officer Lisa Tanaka, both with the local police department for over a decade according to their introductions, listened as Garrett repeated his accusations in a calmer but no less intense manner. He'd brought documentation with him, I realized. A folder he'd been carrying contained a marriage certificate from Philadelphia, dated 8 months prior, showing Isabel Ann Westbrook married to Garrett Michael Carver. There were bank statements showing a joint account they shared. There were lease documents for an apartment in Philadelphia's Rittenhouse Square neighborhood under both their names. Officer Kwan examined the documents carefully, while Officer Tanaka took statements from everyone involved. When she asked me about the life insurance policy, I pulled up the policy documents on my phone and showed her the $3 million coverage with Isabel as beneficiary. Tanaka's expression darkened as she made notes. Mr. Carver, I need to ask you directly. Have you experienced any unusual symptoms or illnesses in the past few months? Unexplained stomach problems? Headaches? Anything that seemed concerning? The question made my blood run cold, because yes, I had been sick. For the past 6 weeks, I'd been dealing with intermittent stomach pain and nausea that I'd attributed to wedding stress and long hours at the hospital. I'd mentioned it to Isabel several times, and she'd been so caring and attentive, making me special meals and bringing me tea to settle my stomach. The tea she made herself in the kitchen while I sat in the living room. The tea she always handed me already prepared. Oh my God, she was poisoning me. Tanaka looked at Kwan, and some unspoken communication passed between them. Kwan pulled out his phone and made a call, requesting a detective to come to the scene. Within 15 minutes, Detective Michael Russo arrived, a veteran investigator with the Special Victims Unit who'd been with the department for 18 years. Russo was in his late 40s with graying hair and the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too much human cruelty. He listened to the overview from the patrol officers, examined the evidence Garrett had brought, and looked through the messages on Isabel's phone that I'd screenshot and sent to my own device. Russo's first action was to separate everyone for individual interviews. He spoke to me first in the private lounge while uniformed officers kept Garrett and Isabel in separate areas of the building. Russo's questions were detailed and specific, walking me through the entire timeline of my relationship with Isabel and asking about every interaction I'd had with my brother regarding her. When I mentioned the stomach problems, Russo became very focused. Did you save any of the tea or food she prepared for you? Any bottles or containers? I shook my head, feeling stupid for not considering the possibility earlier. No, I threw everything away. I didn't think anything was wrong beyond stress. Russo made extensive notes and then asked a question that made everything worse. Did Isabel have access to any medications or substances through her work as a pharmaceutical rep? My mouth went dry. Of course she did. She had samples and connections to experimental drugs and knew exactly what would cause symptoms without being immediately fatal. She would have known how to poison me slowly, making it look like natural illness so that when I eventually died, it wouldn't raise suspicions. Russo saw the realization on my face and nodded grimly. We're going to need to get you to a hospital for a full toxicology screening. Whatever she was giving you, we need to identify it and make sure there's no permanent damage. The wedding reception had been completely abandoned at this point. Dorothy had sent the guests home with apologetic explanations about a family emergency, though I was certain the real story would spread through social media within hours. The country club ballroom sat empty, filled with untouched food and unopened champagne, a monument to the elaborate deception that had just collapsed. Colin had called his firm's criminal defense division and gotten me connected with Sandra Klein, a senior attorney who specialized in fraud and attempted murder cases. Sandra had 32 years of experience and arrived at the country club within 45 minutes of Colin's call. Sandra took control of the situation immediately, conferring with Detective Russo and reviewing all the evidence we'd collected so far. She advised me not to make any more statements without her present and arranged for a private car to take me to the hospital for the toxicology screening. Before I left, Russo informed me that Isabel was being taken into custody for questioning regarding bigamy and possible attempted murder. Garrett was also being taken in for questioning, but as a victim rather than a suspect. The roles had reversed completely from where we'd started the day. At the hospital, my colleagues in the emergency department were shocked to see me arrive still wearing my wedding tuxedo, now rumpled and stained with sweat. Dr. Patricia Newell, the attending physician and someone I'd worked with for 5 years, personally oversaw my care. She drew blood for comprehensive toxicology panels and started me on IV fluids while we waited for results. Patricia knew me well enough not to ask questions beyond the medical necessities, but I could see the concern in her eyes as she examined me. "Ethan, I need you to think carefully. Any unusual tastes in food or drinks lately? Metallic? Bitter? Anything abnormal?" I thought back through the past 6 weeks of meals and suddenly remembered that the tea Isabel made me always had a slightly bitter aftertaste that she'd explained away as being a special herbal blend for digestion. I'd trusted her completely and drank it without question, sometimes twice a day when my symptoms were worse. I described the taste to Patricia and watched her expression darken. She ordered additional specific tests and increased my IV fluids. We're going to run panels for arsenic, thallium, and several other heavy metals along with pharmaceutical compounds. If she had access to drug samples, she could have been giving you almost anything. The toxicology results came back 6 hours later at nearly midnight. I'd been moved to a private room for observation, and Sandra and Colin were with me when Patricia returned with Detective Russo. The news was grim, but not as catastrophic as it could have been. You have elevated levels of arsenic in your system, consistent with chronic low-dose poisoning over several weeks. The good news is that you're going to recover fully with chelation therapy to remove the arsenic from your body. The bad news is that if you'd continued ingesting it for another month or two, the damage would have been irreversible and likely fatal. Russo asked for copies of all medical records and test results for the criminal investigation. He informed us that Isabel had been formally arrested and charged with attempted murder, bigamy, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Her bail had been set at $500,000 based on flight risk, and she was currently being held at the county jail. Garrett had been released after his interview, and Russo said he'd been cooperative in providing evidence against Isabel. "Your brother brought us his phone with additional messages and recordings. He started recording conversations with Isabel 2 weeks ago when he suspected she was planning to harm you. He has her on tape discussing specific plans for making your death look like a heart attack." The recordings. I asked to hear them, and Russo pulled out his phone, playing several clips that he'd already copied as evidence. Isabel's voice was clear and recognizable, discussing with Garrett how she'd increase my arsenic doses while simultaneously slipping me a beta blocker she'd acquired through her pharmaceutical contacts. The combination would make my heart rate irregular and, combined with the stress of my surgical work, would make a cardiac event seem plausible for a man in his early 30s with a demanding career. She talked about timing, waiting until after the wedding, so the life insurance policy was firmly established with her as my wife and legal beneficiary. But in those same recordings, I could hear Garrett pushing back, his voice getting more agitated and desperate. He confronted her about her plans and threatened to tell me everything. Isabel's response was chilling in its calculation. She told him that if he exposed her, she'd claim he was the one who'd planned everything and had forced her to go along with it. She'd position herself as his victim and me as collateral damage in his scheme. Garrett's voice cracked as he begged her to stop, saying he loved her too much to let her become a murderer. That's when he'd decided to disrupt the wedding, knowing it was his last chance to save my life, even if it destroyed his relationship with both of us. I listened to those recordings in my hospital room and felt a complicated mix of emotions that I couldn't begin to untangle. Gratitude toward Garrett for saving my life. Rage at both of them for the deception that had led to this point. Humiliation at being so thoroughly fooled. Grief for the relationship I'd thought I had with Isabel, which had never been real from the start. Sandra had stayed with me through the night, and she put a hand on my shoulder when the recordings ended. "This is solid evidence, Ethan. Combined with the toxicology results and the documentary evidence of the bigamy, the prosecution is going to have an extremely strong case. She's looking at 20 to 30 years in prison." The next few days were a media circus. Word of the disrupted wedding and subsequent arrest spread quickly through medical and social circles. My phone was flooded with calls and messages from colleagues, friends, and even reporters asking for statements. I ignored all of them on Sandra's advice and focused on the chelation therapy treatments Patricia had prescribed. The process of removing arsenic from my system took several days of IV infusions, that left me exhausted and nauseated, ironically experiencing some of the same symptoms the poisoning had caused. Garrett called me on the third day after the wedding that wasn't. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out. His voice was rough and raw when he spoke. "Ethan, I know you probably never want to talk to me again. I know I destroyed everything by being stupid enough to fall for someone who was using both of us, but I needed you to know that I never wanted to hurt you. When I realized what she was planning, I tried everything I could think of to stop it without destroying what we had. I failed at that, but at least you're alive." I sat in my hospital bed listening to my brother cry and felt something in my chest crack open. He'd been played just as thoroughly as I had, maybe more so because his love for Isabel had been real from the start. Mine had been built on deception, but his had been genuine and used against him. "Why didn't you come to me sooner, when you first suspected something was wrong?" Garrett's answer was quiet and ashamed. "Because I was in love with her, and part of me wanted to believe she'd change her mind, that she'd choose me over the plan and we could just disappear together. I was weak and selfish, and it almost cost you your life. I'll never forgive myself for that." We talked for 20 minutes, the first honest conversation we'd had in months. Garrett explained how Isabel had approached him at a real estate networking event, targeting him specifically after researching our family and learning about the inheritance we'd received from our parents. She'd seduced him methodically, creating the perfect relationship while extracting information about me and my career. When she'd learned I was a successful surgeon, she'd convinced Garrett that they should marry secretly, and then she'd pursue me romantically. The plan had been her idea from the start, with Garrett going along because he was too infatuated to see clearly. The bigamy had been part of her strategy. By marrying Garrett first in another state, she'd have a legal spouse who could claim ignorance if the plan fell apart. But by marrying me publicly, she'd position herself as my legal widow with access to the life insurance. The Philadelphia marriage was discoverable, but required someone to look for it, which wouldn't happen if my death appeared natural. She'd calculated every angle with cold precision. Garrett had only realized how dangerous she was when he'd overheard her on the phone with someone discussing accelerating the timeline because she was getting impatient. After my discharge from the hospital, I moved into a hotel rather than returning to the apartment Isabel and I had shared. Sandra advised me to avoid the property until the investigation was complete, and I was happy to comply. The thought of being surrounded by her belongings and the life we'd supposedly been building made me physically ill. Colin helped me pack a bag with essentials and reported that the police had already searched the apartment, finding and seizing several bottles of supplements and teas that Isabel had prepared. Those items were being tested to confirm they contained arsenic and other substances. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks after the arrest. Sandra attended with me, and we listened as the prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney William Frost, who'd been with the DA's office for 15 years, laid out the evidence against Isabel. The charges had expanded to include multiple counts based on the evidence collected: attempted murder in the first degree for the poisoning, 2 counts of bigamy for the marriages to Garrett and me, conspiracy to commit fraud for the life insurance scheme. The judge, Honorable Catherine Moreno, who'd been on the bench for 23 years, reviewed the evidence and denied Isabel's request for bail reduction. Isabel's defense attorney, a public defender named Christopher Lane, tried to argue that his client had been coerced by Garrett and was actually a victim in the situation. The argument fell flat when the prosecution presented the recordings where Isabel clearly outlined her plans and threatened Garrett when he tried to back out. Judge Moreno looked at Isabel with unconcealed contempt. "Ms. Westbrook, you engaged in a sophisticated conspiracy to defraud and murder. You married 2 men with the intention of killing one for financial gain. The evidence against you is substantial, and your danger to the community is clear. Bail is denied, and you will remain in custody pending trial." The trial itself was scheduled for 6 months out, giving both sides time to prepare. In the meantime, I had to deal with the practical aftermath of the disaster. The marriage to Isabel was invalid due to the prior marriage to Garrett, which meant legally I'd never been married despite the ceremony. The life insurance policy was canceled and the premiums refunded. I filed for an annulment on the grounds of fraud and bigamy, which was granted without contest. My apartment lease was in both our names, so I had to go through the process of having her removed, and eventually chose to break the lease entirely and find a new place without the contaminated memories. My relationship with Garrett slowly began to heal, though it would never be what it was before. He entered therapy to process the manipulation he'd experienced and the guilt he carried for not acting sooner. We met for lunch once a week, awkward conversations that gradually became more comfortable as we learned to be brothers again, rather than rivals for the same woman's attention. He'd filed for divorce from Isabel immediately after her arrest, and the proceedings were moving forward without contest since she had bigger legal problems to worry about. The trial, when it finally happened, lasted 2 weeks. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence including the toxicology reports, the marriage certificates, the text messages, the recorded conversations, and testimony from expert witnesses. Medical experts explained how the arsenic poisoning would have killed me within months if left untreated. Financial experts detailed the insurance fraud scheme. Garrett testified about the manipulation and deception, his voice breaking multiple times as he described how Isabel had used his love as a weapon. I testified for 3 hours, walking through the relationship from my perspective and identifying all the warning signs I'd missed because I'd been too trusting. The defense tried to paint me as vindictive and bitter, suggesting I was exaggerating the threat to get revenge on Isabel for choosing my brother over me. Sandra had prepared me for this strategy, and I stayed calm, letting the medical evidence speak for itself. You couldn't fake elevated arsenic levels or the documented poisoning symptoms I'd experienced. Isabel took the stand in her own defense against her attorney's advice, a decision that proved catastrophic for her case. Under cross-examination by ADA Frost, she contradicted herself multiple times and became visibly angry when pressed on the details of her scheme. At one point, she snapped at Frost that if I'd just died when I was supposed to, none of this would have happened. The jury's reaction was visible shock, and the judge had to call a brief recess. When they returned, Isabel's attorney tried damage control, but the outburst had revealed her true character in a way no amount of coach testimony could overcome. The jury deliberated for 8 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. Isabel showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, her face blank and expressionless, like she'd already disconnected from the proceedings. Sentencing was scheduled for 4 weeks later, and during that time, Sandra prepared a victim impact statement for me to read in court. Writing it forced me to confront all the ways the betrayal had affected me, from the physical damage of the poisoning to the psychological trauma of learning that someone I'd loved and trusted had been planning my murder. At the sentencing hearing, I read my statement to the court while Isabel sat at the defense table refusing to look at me. I described the nightmares I had about dying in my sleep from poison, the difficulty I had trusting anyone after such a thorough deception, the shame I felt for being fooled so completely by someone who'd seen me only as a source of money. Judge Moreno listened intently and made notes. When I finished, she asked if Isabel wanted to make a statement before sentencing. Isabel stood slowly, and for the first time since her arrest, she looked directly at me. "I'm not sorry for trying. I'm only sorry I didn't succeed." The courtroom erupted in gasps and outrage. Judge Moreno's face went red with anger, and she slammed her gavel down repeatedly to restore order. When silence finally returned, she addressed Isabel with barely controlled fury. "In my 23 years on this bench, I have never heard such a callous and remorseless statement from a defendant. You have shown no recognition of the evil you attempted and no empathy for your victims. I am sentencing you to the maximum penalty allowed under law. For attempted murder in the first degree, 25 years. For bigamy, 5 years consecutive. For conspiracy to commit fraud, 10 years consecutive. Total sentence, 40 years in state prison with no possibility of parole for 30 years. Isabel's face finally showed emotion, shock and fear as the reality of spending most of her life in prison settled over her. The bailiffs led her away in handcuffs and I watched her go, feeling a strange emptiness where I'd expected satisfaction to be. Justice had been served, but it didn't erase what had happened or restore what had been taken from me. Sandra put a hand on my shoulder. "It's over. She can't hurt you anymore." Colin threw me a small gathering at his house that evening with a few close friends who'd supported me through the ordeal. It wasn't celebratory exactly, more like a wake for the life I'd thought I was building, and a quiet acknowledgement that I'd survived. Garrett came too, and we sat together on Colin's back deck, talking about the future for the first time in months. "I'm thinking about moving," Garrett said quietly. "Philadelphia has too many bad memories. Maybe West Coast, start fresh somewhere new." I understood the impulse, but I knew running wouldn't fix what had broken inside both of us. I returned to work at the hospital the week after sentencing, grateful for the routine and structure of surgical schedules. My colleagues welcomed me back with careful kindness, avoiding the topic of the trial unless I brought it up first. Patricia pulled me aside after my first surgery back and asked how I was really doing. I told her the truth, that I was functioning but not healed, that I didn't know if I'd ever fully trust another romantic relationship, that I woke up some nights with phantom stomach pains from the poisoning even though the chelation therapy had cleared my system months ago. A year after the wedding that wasn't, I received a letter from the prison where Isabel was incarcerated. I almost threw it away unopened, but curiosity won out. Inside was a single page in her handwriting, the same careful script I'd seen on thank you cards and shopping lists. The letter was brief and strange. She claimed she'd had time to reflect and wanted me to know that her feelings for me hadn't been entirely fake. She'd started the relationship as a con, but had found herself genuinely attracted to my intelligence and kindness. That hadn't stopped her from planning to kill me, but she wanted me to know I'd meant something to her beyond just money. I read the letter twice, and then burned it in Colin's fireplace during our weekly dinner. Whatever truth or lies it contained didn't matter anymore. Isabel was part of my past, a cautionary tale about trusting too easily and ignoring warning signs. Garrett had moved to Seattle and was rebuilding his life, and we talked on the phone every few weeks, our relationship still complicated but slowly healing. I'd started seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma from intimate partner violence, learning to process what had happened and recognize that being deceived didn't make me stupid or weak. The wedding venue eventually refunded most of my deposit after Sandra threatened legal action, though they kept enough to cover the food and damage from the disruption. The photographer had tried to charge me for the photos of the ceremony and reception until I pointed out that images documenting an attempted murder probably weren't something I wanted to pay for. I donated my wedding ring to a charity that melted down jewelry and used the proceeds for domestic violence shelters. Isabel's ring was seized as evidence, and I had no idea what happened to it after the trial. 2 years out, I ran into one of Isabel's former colleagues at a medical conference, a pharmaceutical rep named Diana, who'd worked with her in the Philadelphia area. Diana pulled me aside during a break and apologized profusely for not seeing what Isabel was doing. She talked about you constantly at work events, how brilliant you were, how successful, how much you'd be worth someday. I thought she was just proud of her boyfriend, but looking back, she was evaluating you like an investment. I should have said something. I told Diana she had nothing to apologize for, that Isabel had fooled everyone who knew her. Garrett got engaged 3 years after the trial to a woman he met through a mutual friend in Seattle. He called to tell me the news with hesitation in his voice, clearly worried about how I'd react. I told him I was happy for him, and meant it. Rachel seemed genuine and kind when I met her at their engagement party, and she knew the whole story of what had happened with Isabel. She'd chosen to be with Garrett despite his past, which spoke to either her capacity for forgiveness or her courage. Maybe both. I eventually started dating again, though it took years before I could let anyone close enough to matter. A colleague from the hospital's cardiology department named Lauren caught my attention with her dry sense of humor and complete lack of interest in my financial situation. She was independently successful, driven, and had her own life that didn't require me to complete it. Our relationship developed slowly and carefully, with me probably more paranoid about red flags than was healthy. But Lauren was patient and understood why I needed to verify her background and meet her family and see proof that she was who she claimed to be. 5 years after the wedding that wasn't, Garrett and Rachel had their first child, a daughter they named Hope. I was honored when they asked me to be her godfather, standing beside them at the baptism and promising to help guide her life. Holding that tiny baby, I thought about how close I'd come to never meeting her, to being dead in the ground while Isabel spent the life insurance money with my brother. The thought didn't fill me with rage anymore, just a quiet gratitude that Garrett had found the courage to blow up both our lives to save mine. The scars remained, some physical and some psychological. I still had moments of paranoia when someone I was dating acted in ways I couldn't immediately explain. I still checked my food and drinks obsessively when I wasn't the one who prepared them. I still woke up sometimes from nightmares where Isabel succeeded and I died slowly without knowing I was being murdered. But I'd built a good life despite those scars, surrounded by people I'd learned to trust gradually and carefully. Isabel sent one more letter 5 years into her sentence, this time with a tone of desperation rather than manipulation. She'd been denied parole and wouldn't be eligible again for another decade. She wanted to apologize properly and ask if I'd be willing to visit her in prison. I wrote back a single sentence. "You stole enough of my life. You get no more." I never heard from her again. 7 years after the disrupted wedding, I proposed to Lauren on a beach in Maine, where we'd gone for a long weekend. The proposal was quiet and private, just the two of us and the ocean, and a ring I'd chosen carefully with input from her best friend. She said yes, and we held each other while the sun set. And for the first time since that day at the country club, I felt like I understood what marriage should actually be. Not a transaction or a con, but a partnership between two people who genuinely valued each other beyond what they could provide. The wedding was small and intimate, just close friends and family, with Garrett as my best man again. This time, when he stood beside me at the altar, I knew he'd never betray me because we'd already been through the worst possible betrayal and survived it together. Lauren's vows made me cry in a way I wasn't ashamed of, and when we were pronounced husband and wife, the celebration that followed was joyful and real in a way my first wedding could never have been. I thought about Isabel sometimes, sitting in a prison cell with decades still ahead of her, and wondered if she felt any genuine remorse, or if her only regret was still just that she hadn't succeeded in killing me. I decided it didn't matter. She'd lost everything. Her freedom, her future, her chance at any kind of real happiness. I'd lost time and trust, and had to rebuild myself from the foundation up. But I was here, alive and loved, and building something real. And that was the only revenge that mattered, living well and fully while she existed in a cage of her own making. The brother who'd grabbed the microphone at my first wedding and screamed that the bride was his wife had saved my life that day, even as he destroyed his own relationship with both of us. He'd found his way back to happiness eventually, and so had I. The scars we both carried from Isabel's betrayal had changed us permanently, but not entirely for the worse. We'd learned what real loyalty meant, what real love required, what it cost to trust someone, and what it was worth when that trust was genuine. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.